If we are chasing the tulip bulbs of the world, the most we can get is a flower that will die. But if we are chasing the eternal flowers, the eternal fruit, then that will produce everlasting life.
Welcome to this episode of The French Press. Let me pour you a cup of coffee while we talk about intrigues of faith, pages we've dog-eared, and the life in between on The French Press.
Welcome back to this episode of The French Press. This is a podcast where I talk about books I've read, intrigues of faith, and the life in between. If you're someone that likes to read and wishes they had someone to talk to about the books they're reading, this is the perfect podcast for you. Or maybe you're someone that wishes they had more time to read and wants to know more about maybe some of the classics and wants to know more about the Bible. This is also the perfect podcast for you. The thing I'm a little challenged with is organization. I'm kind of a little all over the place. I read probably 8 to 10 books at a time, and I just pull pieces out of them. So this is not like a book review where I've read a whole book and then I'm going to talk about it. I'm actually going to talk about several books in pieces. I may come back and finish talking about them. I may not. You never know. So it's sort of just a little peek into like the books on my nightstand, right? I have like a bunch of them and I just pick different ones to read. And usually I just kind of see how the Holy Spirit brings it all together in addition with where I am in my Bible reading. And I felt like he really did that for this episode. If you listened to last week's, I talked about a book called Hans Brinker or The Silver Skates. So if you haven't listened to last week's, you might want to go back and hear that one because I'll sort of explain this book a little bit better. But it's a children's classic. It takes place in Holland. Gosh, I think it was the 1920s or 40s. So it's older. And it has a lot of history of Holland in it, which I'm really enjoying. So the book started out really interesting. I loved all the history of Holland. The story was pretty good. And then it kind of hit a bit of a lull for me, and I didn't know if I'd come back to it. But I ended up coming back to it, and I actually really, really like it. So if it is a book you're interested in reading, I do suggest it. You know, there's a movie too. You can even watch the movie, but I suggest reading it at this point. I'm about halfway through, and I will finish it. I don't know if I'll talk about it again, but I will definitely finish it. It's very interesting. So last week, we kind of talked about Holland and some of the history of Holland and sort of a little bit of the story going on with Hans Brinker. He wants to race in this ice skating race, but they don't really have money and they can't afford skates, and they've got a lot of issues going on at home. Their father had a head injury and the mother has to work all the time, and the kids are really in poverty and struggling. And it's at contrast with this other group of kids who are very wealthy, and they just have a completely different outlook on life, right? They're much more cavalier. They can kind of do what they want. And then Hans and his sister are really struggling. And so the book kind of points out the different characters of these children, which is very interesting. Kind of the deep character Hans and his sister have, how they really have to make adult decisions with what they do with their money and their time. And then this other group of kids, they can kind of do whatever they want. They have money to spend and they can go about and have fun. And that's an interesting contrast in itself, in that she gets a little deeper into this idea of sort of the characters of these children and what life has brought them. And so last week we talked about pruning and how the Lord prunes us and he cuts things back and out of our life and off our life. And they're not necessarily bad things, but they're a stunted growth. And he may cut something back or take something away because he wants you to grow. And you can certainly see that with Hans and Gretel as they have to deal with their father, with the poverty, with just not having luxuries in life, having to really look at life differently. They're much more grateful for the little things they do get, and where the other children just can kind of have whatever they want, and they don't have a lot of gratitude for those things. So going on in the story, a group of boys, and these are the wealthier boys, a group of boys have decided they have a cousin that's in town, and he's from England, and they're going to take him about Holland and show him all the sights. And I like the way the author uses this as a vehicle to teach the readers all about Holland. And she's able, through these boys and their tours, she's able to give her readers sort of like a little like, here's something interesting about Holland. Here's this interesting thing as they show this English cousin. I like that part. I love history. So I think if you're someone that likes history and likes to know about different cultures and different time periods, you would really enjoy that aspect of the book. One particular part I'm going to talk about right now is tulips. I think we all know tulips are very popular in Holland. It's kind of what you think of. If you think of, at least I do, if I think of the Dutch or I think of Holland, tulips come to mind, windmills, tulips. And these boys tell the English cousin the story of Tulip Mania, which I had heard of this before and kind of forgotten it, but there was a time where people just went crazy over tulips. Like they were willing to sell everything and anything to get a hold of tulips. And all of a sudden, tulip bulbs became like the hottest commodity on the market. They were more valuable than gold, which is interesting. It's funny how we value different things in our world system. We decide what's valuable. Is a tulip bulb really worth, like I think at one point they say it's worth like its weight in gold. Is it? It just society at that moment decided it was, and it was sort of like a mania or a fever. People were on fire for tulips. And we can look throughout history and see different things that have, become popular. I remember in the book Little Women, if you've read that, at one point in the schoolyard, one of the girls, the popular thing is pickled limes, and it's all the rage, and everybody has pickled limes, and they use the rag money that week, so Amy, the youngest one, can buy pickled limes because that's what's popular. And to me, there's just these expressions of this throughout society of what we're willing to spend money on, what becomes a treasure, what becomes important. And at this particular time period, it was tulip bulbs. So he gives a little history, or the author does, of the first tulip was sent here from Constantinople about the year 1560. It was so much admired that the rich people of Amsterdam sent to Turkey for more. From that time, they grew to be the rage, and it lasted for years. Single roots bought from 1 to 4,000 florin, and one bulb bought for 5,500. Now, I'm not sure what the equivalent of today is, but I have a feeling it was quite a lot. So this is how they started trading, and what they started using instead of money were these bulbs. And I just thought that was really interesting and sort of comes into play when the Bible talks about like where your treasure is, there your heart is. And I just started thinking about their treasure became these bulbs. And you could even make the argument a tulip bulb is actually very unattractive. Bulbs are very ugly. Now they will hopefully produce something. So you're buying this sort of ugly bulb, hoping it will be planted and it will grow into something, but it's a bit of a risk. Is that worth putting your money in? What if it doesn't grow? What if it doesn't make it? What if you don't water it enough and it doesn't grow into this tulip? And even if it does grow into the most perfect, beautiful tulip and it was everything, they hoped it would be, it's going to die, right? It's not going to live forever, which talks about temporal treasures and spiritual treasures. And the Bible brings this up so often. Where is our treasure? Where are we gathering gold? Is it in heaven where it can't rust and the moths can't eat it? Or is it here on earth? And I'm sure none of us are willing to spend our weight in gold on a tulip bulb, but there's probably something else, right? What are we looking at in our lives that we're willing to spend a lot of time and money on? And even if it becomes everything we hope it'll be, whatever it is, maybe you're in a sporting event and you win that event and you've put so much time and practice and you win it and it's the best thing ever. It will eventually fade away. Or maybe you've created something, an art, or you've knitted something, or, you've worked on a project for a really long time and got really good at it. Maybe you won awards and maybe got accolades for it. And yet eventually it'll break down. Not that there's anything wrong with going after those things, but if they're our treasure, if that's what our heart is longing for, we're going to be disappointed because it's always going to die and decay. And yet if we chase after, heavenly rewards and heavenly crowns, those things are eternal. And I just thought the Tulip Mania was really interesting. Here it is, even in this time period, there's something they're going after. Another part that I thought was interesting is apparently at this time period, Dutch people would have something they called pavilions. And they were these little small places, almost like a little deck or a dock on the water. And it didn't sound like it really had, walls. Maybe it had a roof on it. But it's where they'd go and spend time in the summer. So in theory, I feel like probably the richer people had it maybe on the canals, but the poorer people kind of had it in these little ditches. And they would actually talk about that it didn't always smell the best, but this is what people did. And they would build these little pavilions. It says they were small affairs, suitable only to spend a few hours on a summer afternoon. And I think that sounds really lovely, actually. I live by Lake Michigan, and I would love to have a little dock on Lake Michigan that I could go and spend a few hours. But this was something everybody had. But what I thought was interesting is that they would write little mottos over these little pavilions. So this was like a big thing. Everybody had a motto. And this keeps coming up in the book. They keep talking about, well, what's your motto? And what are you about? And it almost feels like these pavilions are a way to display maybe what you have. Can you have a really nice pavilion with lots of tulips and flowers and paintings, or is it more simple? And what's your motto? What did you write over your pavilion? And the children sort of talk about what different mottos they have written over their pavilion. It says that with their little bridges and ponds and gardens, their mottos were over the doorway. And so they're going through in the winter, but he's talking about they make but little show now, but in the warm weather they are delightful. After the willows sprout, Uncle goes to his summer house every afternoon. So they call them summer houses, but they're actually just these little docks or pavilions. He dozes and smokes. Aunt knits with her feet perched upon a foot stove. Never mind the hot day. And it talks about how the kids would fish and they would play around, and ultimately they would have this little motto written over it. And I thought that part was interesting too. And it kind of comes up throughout the book, and it made me think about if you could have a little pavilion, what would your motto be over your house? And I think that's something to sort of think about, as we move forward into the other books. So going along with the tulip and the kind of the gardening reference, I am in Numbers right now. And in number 17, something kind of interesting happens that caught my eye and made me think about not only the tulips and the pruning that we talked about last week in the last episode, how the Lord prunes us back so we produce more. And I thought in number 17, this part was really interesting it's a part about the budding of Aaron's rod. So let me set this up for you a little bit. Aaron and Moses have been taking the Israelites through the desert, and there's a bit of an uprising. And some people come forward and are sort of like, well, who are you to think you're in charge? Like, maybe we should be in charge. And so Moses says, well, let's ask the Lord. And so, Moses talks to the Lord about it, and he's basically like, let's have each household or he calls them the princes, probably of each bloodline, bring a rod, And so Aaron also brings one for the Levites, and they put them into the tabernacle. And he says, okay, put all your rods here. I think they write their names on them. Put all your rods into the tabernacle. And there's 12 rods in total, which of course represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And we're going to see what happens with these rods. So the Lord says, whoever I choose, that rod will blossom. And this will put an end of this rebellion. Basically, I will choose through the rod who's in charge, and then no more murmuring. Then we're done with this. Like, this will put to rest who's in charge. So Moses, tells the people to do this. They write their names on the rods. They put them in there, and they go into the tabernacle of witness. This is chapter 17, verse 7. And then in 8, it says, and it came to pass that on the morrow, Moses went into the tabernacle of witness, and behold, the rod of Aaron for the house of Levi was budded, and brought forth buds, and bloomed blossoms, and yielded almonds. And Moses brought them out and showed everybody, and that was the end of the murmuring, because clearly the Lord had chosen Aaron to have this role. And I just found this really interesting, I think partly because I'm also had just been in John and was reading about the abiding on the vine and how God prunes us so we produce more. And here we are with sort of this picture again, this analogy of God will make things blossom. He will make things blossom in our life. And sometimes it's through trials and it's through hardship. When we watch someone work in a garden, if you don't know what they're doing, it might be confusing why they're cutting a tree back so harshly. This branch has beautiful flowers on it. Why are you cutting it off? Because the gardener, the good gardener, knows this could actually be better. And so God is the one who decides. He's the one who decides what will blossom and what will bloom if we let him be Lord of our life, which as Christians, that is something we want to do, is let him be the gardener, let him design it, let him decide, what is allowed to blossom in our life and what he wants to cut back. And it can be really painful, but we want, him to be the one doing it. And we want to be in a place where we just trust him, even though it may not make sense. Like, well, why did I lose that job? Or why did we have to move? Or, why didn't I win this thing? I worked so hard at it. Or why didn't this ministry work out? Or fill in the blank with whatever is going on in your life that you're maybe thinking, well, why isn't this producing fruit? And not only that, but why is it getting cut back? Or maybe you're like, this is producing fruit. Why is God stopping it? Why isn't this moving forward? Why isn't there growth here? So when we look at God as the gardener and trust him, we're able to have a little more peace with that idea. I'm not saying it's easy. It's painful to be cut back. It's very painful to be pruned, but it's the idea of producing more. And so you see in Aaron's rod how much was produced. It went beyond flowers and it produced almonds. And I thought that was really interesting. There's obviously a lot happening in this chapter, and this is about the Israelites and it's about a different time period, but the Bible has so many layers to it, right? It's a living word. It's alive, and it speaks to us where we are, but it tells the story, this true story that was happening at this time period, and this is what it means. But then there's ways to say, how can this apply today too? Because we are still being pruned and we are still producing fruit and maybe even almonds. And I just think there's a lovely kind of shadowing and story here of how God prunes us and how God is the one that produces the good things in our lives if we let him. And I thought it was interesting that it produced almonds. So I did a little bit of a quick study on almonds. You could actually do a pretty in-depth study on almonds. I could do a whole talk on it, but I'm going to give you just kind of the quick things I came up with. The word almonds in the Hebrew is actually kind of means shaked, which was interesting. And it had a Hebrew word that I cannot pronounce, but you can see it has a root word of shake in it. And the idea is the almond meant to be shaken or to be wakeful and watchful. One person described it as the almond represents an industrious person who studied the Torah and through diligence and perseverance, was able to study and understand the word. And often the almond is a sign of hope that God will fulfill his promises. So we can certainly see that with Aaron's rod, that God is going to fulfill his promises to the Israelite people. And he's going to do it, through Moses and Aaron are going to be the leaders. Aaron is going to be the line of Levites. They are going to be the priestly people, and God's going to pick them. And he will cut them back when he needs to, and he will prune them when he needs to. But this is the line he's chosen. And it will produce almonds despite themselves, right? Sometimes God uses people that even though they've got terrible things in their past or they struggle with something, and we can think of a lot of examples out of the Bible. We've got Moses, who was a murderer. We've got Elijah, who struggled with, he wanted to just die. He was so upset. So, just things weren't going his way and he just wanted it to be done. We've got Joseph, who was sold into slavery, and his brothers who sold him, and yet they were forgiven by him. We see all these pictures of people who just gone through really terrible things. Joseph is a great example of someone who was pruned and pruned and pruned. He had everything taken from him, his family, his land, his people, his future. Everything was taken. He was sold into slavery. He was wrongly accused and put in jail. And yet God cut him back to nothing. He must have thought so many times, what is going on? And yet God knew, if I cut him back, he will grow so strong and so mighty that he ended up becoming the second in command of Egypt at the time. And he was able to save all his people. And what a lineage he has. And I was actually reading I think this is back in Acts, about how Joseph said, take my bones with you when you make it to the promised land. I know you'll make it to the promised land someday. And I probably won't physically get there, but take my bones with you. And you actually see that a couple times in scripture where it's like someone's given a promise that they know they probably won't see in their lifetime. You see that with Abraham, and you see it with Joseph, and they say, these promises have been given. God has given us these promises. I may not see it in my lifetime, but God will fulfill them. So take my bones into the promised land. That has always struck me, that idea of believing these promises, even if you don't see them in your lifetime. And maybe you are planting seeds right now. Maybe you are ministering to your family, or you're planting a little church, or you're talking to somebody about the Lord. Maybe you're mentoring somebody, or maybe it's even just yourself. You're reading the word and you're kind of struggling through it and you're trying to figure out faith. But if you can know, if you can have that hope, God will answer to these questions. God will fulfill this. God will grow this thing. If it is his will, if it is of him, this will produce not only flowers, but it will produce almonds. And also almonds are one of the earliest things to come into bloom. So it's a sign of quickness. Like almonds are, this will happen quickly. And I thought that was interesting for Aaron's rod, right? Because this happens overnight. Like they just have these rods of wood. Doesn't sound like they watered them or planted them. There were no seeds involved. It was all spiritual, right? God spiritually made that rod produce not only flowers, but almonds. So there could be no doubt that this is what he chose. And maybe you have a place in your life that is starting to sprout. Maybe you've been reading the word for a while now and you're starting to fall in love with it and you're starting to get it. And you could even maybe talk to someone about it. If someone asked you questions, you could answer some of those questions now and you're starting to see that fruit. Or maybe you've been called into a ministry, or you're doing something in your work life or your personal life where you're like, I've been planting seeds here for a while. I've been working on this and God is watering them and I'm watching them come to fruition. And don't let those pass you by. 'Cause sometimes I think we get to a place in life and we don't even appreciate how far we've come. Like maybe you do have a daily devotion that you've been doing for a while now, and it just seems like, well, this is just what I do, but you weren't doing it a few years ago. You were maybe never reading the Bible. Maybe you had almost no prayer life, and now you get together and you pray with people. Or if someone asks you for prayer, you're like, let me pray with you right now. And you wouldn't have done that, years ago. So try to take note. what's that saying? Stop and smell the roses. Maybe try to stop and smell the roses in your own life and take a moment and say, where was I a few years ago? And where am I now spiritually? What do I understand? Is my hope stronger? Is my faith stronger? Is my testimony stronger? And maybe you have a rod that was nothing. It was just, your life was just kind of a plain stick and there was nothing of beauty in it. And you came from some dark places and now there's some flowers. Now you've collected some lovely friendships and you've poured into some people and you've mentored some people and you've trained some people and they've produced flowers and maybe some have even produced almonds. And maybe take the time to look around and think about that. Think about where you are right now and where you're headed, and use that rod as a testimony to say, look where I was and look where I am now. That's all the Lord, all the glory to Him. And I'm going to introduce a new book. Okay, this one, it's called Instruments in the Redeemer's Hands by Paul David Tripp. And the little subtitle is People in Need of Change, Helping People in Need of Change. It's a really big book with lots of words. And I was a little bit like, I don't know if I'm going to get to this book. Like, I've got all these other books I'm reading. This was just one of the many books next to my bed. And one night I had none of the regular books I wanted and I didn't want to get up. But I was like, but I should read a little bit. And I pulled this book off the floor and I'm not very far in. I'll tell you that. I'm like a quarter of a way in and it has really blown me away. And it, to me, and you may not feel this way, to me, it just looks so boring. It has a boring cover and I look at it and I think, oh, this is a really dense book with lots of words and just filled up the pages. And frankly, I was not that interested in it. And it was given to me as a gift when I joined my church. This was the book they gave me. And I just thought, oh yeah, I'll just stick it on my bookshelf. And well, I have to say I was wrong about this book. I judged it harshly. And it has touched me really deeply just in the little bit I've read it. And I'm thinking I will talk about it more than just today. But there is one section I want to talk to you about that goes along with all of this. I actually, once again, last night, I was like, oh, I don't have the books I'm reading next to my bed, but this book's here. And I don't really feel like reading it because it really challenges me. And I don't necessarily love to be that challenged that late at night. And I was pretty tired and I just thought, I don't know if I really want to read this book. But I started reading it. I read a chapter. And it went exactly with everything I've been talking, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. And I marked this book up so much. So I'm going to tell you about it. This chapter I read last night is, I believe, chapter 4. Let me get to it. Okay, it's chapter 4, and it's called The Heart is the Target. And he gives this little illustration of how his family went on this trip to the Grand Canyon and how all 4 of them had a really different experience at the Grand Canyon, although they were at the exact same place at the exact same time. And I thought, well, that's a really interesting analogy of life, huh? Like, how often are many of us kind of going through the same thing at the same time, but some people are handling it really well and some people are not, or some people are dealing with fear and some people are excited, and just how differently we all handle it. And so he talked about, like, his mother was afraid of heights, so she was terrified, and him and his young brother, they were like teenagers, I think, and they were just having a great time. They didn't care if they fell off the side. They were having so much fun. And the dad was worried about the mom and the kids, and he's running back and forth between them. So he's kind of harried. And I just thought, oh yeah, how often do we, whatever, maybe we're called to something new, or we're asked, God is pulling us away from something, and we can choose to be harried and crazy, or we can choose to be fearful. Or we can choose, like those teenage boys, to be excited and think, oh, this is really fun. Who cares if I fall off the side of this mountain? Not even thinking that way. I just thought that was an interesting analogy. And he takes it into how what really matters in the way we experience life is where our heart is at. And he's really just targeting the heart. Where is your heart? What does your heart think? Our actions can be right. We can do the right thing. We can be moral. We can say the right words. But if our heart isn't in it, we'll always go back to whatever the thing is. Maybe it's fear, maybe it's control, maybe it's anger, maybe it's apathy. But if our hearts are changed, we will actually do those things naturally. And so one of the headings, so this is where I thought it got interesting, one of the headings is called Fruits, Roots in the Heart. And basically everything we just talked about with in Numbers and what we talked about in John last week, he just really pulls this together beautifully. I would encourage you to get this book and read it. So far, like I said, I'm a quarter of a way in, but I'm going to read a little bit of it to you. He says, if you plant apple seeds and they take root, you don't expect to see peaches or oranges growing. You expect apple seeds to become apple trees that produce apples. There's an organic relationship between the roots of the plant and the fruit it produces. So he's pulling this out of Luke 6, where Christ says, no good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. For out of the overflow of the heart, his mouth speaks. So he's talking about how the way we talk, the way we behave is really an overflow of our heart. So the fruit we produce is really an overflow of the roots we put down. So if our roots are in Christ, if our roots are in eternal things, our mouth will say eternal things. We will speak life. Yes, we will struggle and we will be sad and we will have all the human emotions, but ultimately we will be able to get to a place of hope and of that deep peace. But if our roots are in something else, if our roots are in worldly accolades, worldly rewards, if we are chasing the tulip bulbs of the world, the most we can get is a flower that will die. But if we are chasing the eternal flowers, the eternal fruit, then that will produce everlasting life. And he really explains this well in this chapter, that he says in Christ's metaphor, fruit equals our behavior. This passage discusses our words. Christ says that our words are literally our heart overflowing. People and situations don't make us say what we say, though we tend to blame them. Our words are controlled by our hearts, and our hearts produce behavior. Like, how often do we think, well, work is really stressful. These kids are really hard. This marriage is really difficult. This health problem makes me this way. And I'm not negating any of that. It does. Those are huge challenges. There are so many challenges in our life and so many struggles. But ultimately, they can't make us either have hope or not have hope. It can't be situational. We have to have something steadfast. That is why in the Word we're told to stand on the rock of God and not the shifting sands of our lives. Because our lives, many, many storms will blow in. We know that. The Bible tells us that. There will be trouble. You will have storms. Things will arise. There will be health crises, and there will be job losses, and there will be financial troubles, and there will be troubles with that kid, and there will be troubles with friends. I mean, life has troubles because we live in a sinful, fallen world. But yet we can stand on the rock of God, and we can have that anchor of hope to our soul. So even when we're like, here's everything going wrong, yet I have hope. Even if I don't see this thing come to fruition in my life, kind of like Abraham and Joseph said, even if I don't get to set foot on the promised land, I don't get to watch this kid become what I hoped he would. I don't get to experience this marriage become what I had hoped for. This job will never, satisfy in the way I wanted it to. Even this ministry may never grow in the way I thought it would. I still can rely on God's promises and know that one way or another, his will be done. His word will not come back void. And so I really liked how he pulled this in. It made me think of the verses where it's like, create in me a clean heart, God. I think David says that in the Psalms. Sorry if I'm wrong about that. I find myself praying that a lot lately. Create in me a clean heart. Clean out my heart, Lord. Get in the nooks and crannies and the dark spots of my heart when I'm complaining, when I'm depressed, when I'm sad, when I'm angry. And again, we will have these emotions. I'm not saying we should be these happy robots. We're going to feel those things. We're going to have to talk about them. We're going to have to process them. We're going to have to pray about them. But ultimately, when I get through all the feelings and the words and get down to the bottom of it, what is my prayer? And I really want it to be, change my heart, Lord. Help me to weather this storm well. Help me to weather this pruning well. Help me to walk through this and have my heart be changed so I can produce those almonds, so I can produce that fruit, so I can provide for other people. He talks a lot about the cry of our heart should really be to worship God and to serve him. And I find myself in conflict with that quite a bit. I find myself wanting to worship other things. I want to worship travel. I want to worship a beautiful home. I want to worship doing fun things with friends. I want to worship, maybe writing for me, doing something in my gifting, and not worship God, who those things are just an outpouring. They're a way I can worship him in my relationships, in my work, in even my rest time, and in the things I do for fun. There can be worship if my heart is right in those things, and I'm not chasing those things, but I'm using them as a place to worship God. When I take this trip, I can pray over these areas I'm going to. I could maybe talk to this person and plant a little seed. When I play this sport, how can I behave in that sport so my testimony is strong, even if I lose, even if I win? He talks about in the book that often we even sin in our blessings. And that really struck me too. He says, you can look at children and see how they tease the kid that's not as smart, or they tease the kid that's not as good at sports. These people have a blessing in that area. Maybe they're really athletic, or they're really academic, or they're really good socially, and they'll kind of tease or mock people that struggle in that. So here they are blessed, and they're sinning in the blessing. And how often do we do that? We have a place we excel in, and we're like, I'm really good at this. This comes really easily and naturally to me. And we sort of, maybe as adults, we don't mock people, but we maybe look down on other people who are like, oh, why can't you do this? This is so easy for me. Instead of being like, wow, I'm really blessed in this area, and I need to look at it as such and not look at it as like, this comes so easy, everyone should be doing this. And also, obviously, not sinning in our struggles and where we can get really down or start to be judgmental or critical, or just kind of where we go in these places. It's interesting how he brings that up. He says that in many ways, we deny this connection and blame people and circumstances for our actions and our words. Here, Christ calls us to humbly accept responsibility for our behavior. He calls us to humbly admit that relationships and circumstances are only the occasion in which our hearts reveal themselves. If my heart is the source of my sin problem, then lasting change must always travel through the pathway of my heart. It's not enough to alter my behavior or to change my circumstances. Christ transforms people by radically changing their hearts. So we've kind of looked at how God cultivates us, how God prunes us, and how we want to behave during that pruning. And then how we want to behave once we've had the pruning and maybe we're starting to produce fruit in an area that we still want to remember to not worship that, but to worship God, and to not use it to self-serve, but to use it to serve others. So my new prayer has been to make sure I'm worshiping God and servicing him, and that it's coming out of a place of my heart and not a behavioral or just a way I think I should be, but a place that I actually am getting to in my heart. He says our behavior is ruled not by worship and service of the Lord, but by the ravenous desire for something in the creation. As John Calvin said, our hearts are idol factories, and our words and actions are shaped by our pursuit of the things our hearts crave. So we want to make sure we're craving God and we're craving service to him and worship to him. Just like in Hans Brinker, they craved these tulip bulbs and they were willing to sell everything for these tulip bulbs, which would produce a temporal flower. Are we willing to sell everything for that eternal flower, that eternal almond that produces something lasting, and not go after something temporal? And then I will finish up with going back to that idea of Hans Brinker with the pavilions and how they had the little motto over their pavilion. And I've always loved the verses about how where your heart is, there your treasure lies. That is something that has always struck me. And I think, oh, what a perfect motto that would be over a pavilion. where is my heart? Because that's where my treasure will be. And I want my treasure to be Christ. And I want my treasure to be his word and following him, and not the things that are around it, but just actual him. And what would your motto be? If you think about it, what would your motto have been 5 years ago? Where have you come? Where would your motto be now? Where do you want it to be? It's almost like the idea of, what verse is really speaking to you right now? What would you put over your little pavilion home? Stop and smell the roses. Look at how far you've come, but also look towards the future. How much more do you want to grow? How much more do you want to serve and worship God? I assume I will be reading a lot more of Instruments in the Redeemer's Hand. And I think I will continue on with Hans Brinker. I mean, I know I'll finish it. Hopefully I'll talk about it again. But I suggest both these books. If you want to get them and read them and listen to these podcasts, I would love to hear about it. Post something on social media. Follow me on social media. I do have a French Press page on Facebook. I would love it if you tell me if you've read these books, if you're interested in reading these books. Please follow the podcast. Please share it. I'm really excited to see what God does with everything I'm learning and able to put out through this podcast. Thank you for following and supporting and sharing. Thank you for those that tell me that it blesses you. That blesses me so much. And I really want this to be a place I can worship God and serve others. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to next time. I'm so glad you joined me today on the French Press. If you liked what you heard, you should follow me. That way you'll get all the latest episodes. And if you wouldn't mind taking a minute to rate the show. Also, if you'd like to follow my blog, The Demi-Tasse Drafts, I have a link below in the show notes. Follow me on Instagram and Facebook. Anytime you can leave a like, comment, reshare a post. All these help my ministry get more traction. The most important thing you can do is pray. I really appreciate all of your support. Thank you for sharing a French Press with me today.